Good afternoon, dear students. Today's class we are going to learn about rulers and buildings. Rulers and buildings, especially the art and architecture in the medieval period. So, what we are studying actually, so between 750 AD to 1750. So, in between these years, so what were the art and architectures, the sculptures developed in our subcontinent about we are studying? See, dear students, we all knows that, so still we can see one of the beautiful structure which was actually constructed around 1199. 1199. So in Delhi, so that is about Qutub Minar. So Qutub Minar, I think you all of you heard about this. See, the Qutub Minar, it was constructed around 1199 by Qutbuddin Ayyub. It was constructed by it was constructed by around 1199 by Qutbuddin Ayyub. See, you see that even it has given in the text also the pattern. So the pattern created under the balcony by the small arcs and geometrical designs. Getting these students. So the pattern created under the balcony by the small arcs. You see that there are so many small arcs and geometrical designs. Getting these students. And you can observe that two bands of inscriptions under the balcony also. So actually these are the Arabic words. These are in Arabic language. See, the surface of the Qutub Minar is curved and angular. The surface of the Qutub Minar so is curved and angular. So placing an inscription on such a surface required great precision. Getting? So only the most skilled craft persons could perform this task. It's a really a challenging task for the what we call those who are actually constructed or the crowd persons. They may a very well skilled crowd persons. Only those skilled crowd persons so could perform this challengeable task. And also, dear students, please try to remember that a very few buildings were made of stone or bricks 800 years ago. So, about 800 years ago, a very few buildings are made of stone or brick. And what would have been the impact of a building like the Qutub Minar? So, especially in 13th century. See, between the 8th and 18th century, between between the 8th and 18th century, kings and their officers built two kinds of structures. Getting dear students. So between 8th and 18th century, kings and officers, I mean the courtesans, understood. So they were built two kinds of structure. Two kinds of structure. See the first one. So what was the first? The first structure. So it is about actually the first structures were forts, palaces, even the gardens. Okay, so fort, palaces, garden, residences, and tombs. So these were the first structure. These were the first structure. See, why actually these were constructed by kings and his officers, or I mean kings and their officers, especially save, protection, and grand eyes. So actually, these are all the forts, palaces, garden, and residences and tombs. For the first thing, for safe and protected and grand eyes. Grand eyes means it is what we call bhavyavada ಅಂತ ಏನು ಕರಿತೀವಲ್ಲ ಮಕ್ಕಳ. So that understood. So the beautiful to show the beauty, the what we called in Kannada the beautiful word bhavyava ಅದನ್ನು ತೋರಿಸ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೋಸ್ಕರ. See, these actually safe, protected, and grandiose places of rest in this world and the next understood. So, the second structures. What were the second structures? So, this is all about the first structures such as forts, palaces, gardens, residences, and tombs. And these, the second structure, so these were meant for public activity, especially for public activity. The second type of structures were the second type of structures were built for or constructed for or meant for public activity. So that is including temples and even the mosques. Understood? Temples, mosques, and tanks, and wells, and caravanserais, okay, and bazaars, etc. And bazaars. So, what is the caravanserais? That means actually court and that provide accommodation for caravans. Understood now? So that used to called as a caravanserais. Caravanserais, that means court and that provide accommodation for caravans. So these were actually second type of structure. Getting these students. So between 8th and 18th century, the kings and their officers. So they were built two kinds of structure. The first forts, palaces, gardens, residences, and tombs. Especially safe, protected, and grandiose places of rest in this world and the next. And the second were structures which are constructed for or built for public activity. So, including temples, mosques, tanks, and wells, caravanserais, and even the bazaars also. I mean the marketplaces. Getting these students. See, kings were expected to care for their subjects. Of course, it was common for. Okay, so kings were expected to care for their subjects and by making structures for their use and comfort. So rulers hoped with their praise, construction activity was also carried out by others. So including merchants. So they built, even the merchants also built many temples, mosques and wells. However, domestic architecture, large mansions, which we used to call as havelis, okay, of merchants, has survived only from the 18th century. So, during 18th century, the domestic architectures, large mansions of merchants has survived only from this century. I mean from the 18th century. Now let us discuss about engineering skills and construction. Engineering skills and constructions. engineering skills and construction. See, monuments provide an insight into the technologies used for construction. Getting now? So, monuments provide an insight into the technologies used for construction. So, take something like a roof for example. Roof. See, we can make this by placing wooden beams or a slab of stone across four walls. What we call actually the roof ಅಥವಾ ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಏನು ಕರಿತೀವಿ ಮೇಲ್ಛಾವಣಿ ಅಂತ. ಸೊ ಹೇಗೆಲ್ಲ ಮಾಡ್ಬೋದು ವುಡನ್ ಬೀಮ್ ಹಾಕಿ ಮಾಡ್ಬೋದು ಅಥವಾ ಸ್ಟೋನ್ ಸ್ಲ್ಯಾಬ್ ಹಾಕಿ ನಾಲ್ಕು ಗೋಡೆಗಳ ಮಧ್ಯೆ ಮಾಡ್ಬೋದು. ಅಂಡ್ ನವ್ ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಆಕ್ಚುಲಿ ವಿ ಆರ್ ಯೂಸಿಂಗ್ ಹೈನ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಸಿಮೆಂಟ್ ಸ್ಲ್ಯಾಬ್ ಹಾಕಿರ್ತೀವಿ, ಅದು ಕಾಂಕ್ರೀಟ್ ಸ್ಲ್ಯಾಬ್ ಹಾಕ್ಬೋದು. See, but the task becomes difficult if we want to make a large room with an elaborate superstructure. So, difficult ಅಂದಾಗ ವಿಶಾಲವಾದಂತಹ ಕನ್ಸ್ಟ್ರಕ್ಷನ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತಂದಾಗ ಅಥವಾ ಲಾರ್ಜ್ ರೂಮ್ ಕನ್ಸ್ಟ್ರಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಅಂದಾಗ, ಸೊ to make a large room with an elaborate superstructure, so that requires more sophisticated skills. ಸೊ ನಾರ್ಮಲ್ ಆಗಿ ನಾವು ವುಡನ್ ಬೀಮ್ ಹಾಕಿನೋ ಅಥವಾ ಸ್ಟೋನ್ ಸ್ಲ್ಯಾಬ್ ಹಾಕಿ ಸ್ಟೋನ್ ಸ್ಲ್ಯಾಬ್ ಹಾಕಿನೋ ಅಥವಾ ಕಾಂಕ್ರೀಟ್ ಹಾಕಿನೋ ಮಾಡಿ. ಸೊ ಆಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಇಟ್ಸ್ ರಿಕ್ವೈರ್ಡ್ ಎಲೋಬರೇಟ್ ಸೂಪರ್ ಸ್ಟ್ರಕ್ಚರ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಮಕ್ಕಳ, ದಟ್ ಇಸ್ ನಥಿಂಗ್ ಬಟ್ the part of a building above the ground floor, that is called as superstructure. Superstructure means the part of a building above the ground floor. So above the ground floor is there, no, the part of the building that used to called as a superstructure. Getting now? See, between the 7th and 10th centuries, architects started adding more rooms. So between 7th and 10th centuries, so architects started adding more number of rooms and even doors and windows to buildings. Getting now? So more number of rooms, more number of doors and more number of windows to buildings. Roofs, doors and windows were still made by placing a horizontal beam across two vertical columns. ಏನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು ಮಕ್ಕಳ? ಸೊ ದ ರೂಫ್, ಡೋರ್ ಮತ್ತು ವಿಂಡೋಸ್ ದಟ್ ವರ್ ಸ್ಟಿಲ್ ಮೇಡ್ ಬೈ ಪ್ಲೇಸಿಂಗ್ ಅ ಹಾರಿಜಾಂಟಲ್ ಬೀಮ್ across two vertical columns. A style of architecture. So this style of architecture that is called as trabeate. Understood now? So this kind of architecture is called as trabeate. See, and also it is called as corbel. And also it is called as corbel. Okay. See, between the 8th and 13th century, the trabeate style was used in the construction of temples, mosques, tombs, and in buildings attached to large stepped wells. That what we called biolis. Okay. So, ಈ ಒಂದು ಸ್ಟೈಲ್ ಅನ್ನ, ಈ ಒಂದು ಕೋರ್ಬೆಲ್ ಟ್ರಾಬಿಯೇಟ್ ಸ್ಟೈಲ್ ಅನ್ನ ಎಸ್ಪೆಷಲಿ 8ನೇ ಮತ್ತೆ 13ನೇ ಸೆಂಚುರಿನಲ್ಲಿ, 8ರಿಂದ 13ನೇ ಸೆಂಚುರಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಕಟ್ಟಿದಂತಹ ಆ ಒಂದು ಕನ್ಸ್ಟ್ರಕ್ಷನ್ಗಳೇನಿದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಈ ಒಂದು ಸ್ಟೈಲ್ ಅನ್ನ ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು. ಎಸ್ಪೆಷಲಿ ಟೆಂಪಲ್ಸ್ ಆಗ್ಬೋದು, ಮಾಸ್ ಆಗ್ಬೋದು, ಟೂಮ್ಸ್ ಆಗ್ಬೋದು, ಈ ಒಂದು ಸ್ಟೈಲ್ ಅನ್ನು ನಾವು ಕಾಣ್ತೀವಿ. ಗೆಟಿಂಗ್ now let us discuss about the different technological and stylistic developments which are especially noticeable from the 12th century. So actually there were two technological and stylistic developments. Two technological and stylistic developments are noticeable from the 12th century. So what are those two technological and stylistic developments? So let us see that. So the first one, The weight of the superstructure, the weight of the superstructure above the doors and windows was sometimes carried by arms. So, are you getting now? So, the weight of the superstructure above the doors and windows was sometimes carried by arms. So, please look your textbook, page number 63 and figure 5 here. So, there is a very clear that arch. See, this architectural form it was called as arcade. Understood? So, this type of this is called as arcade. Getting now? So this is the one technological and stylistic developments. That is the weight of the superstructure above the doors and windows was sometimes carried by arms. So this architectural form was called arcade. Okay. So just you can see that page number 163 understood. So that picture then you can understand easily. And the second development, the second technological and stylistics developments are limestone cement was increasingly used in construction. So this is what the second one in the technological and stylistic developments. Limestone cement was increasingly used in construction. So this was very high quality cement. So the cement which was made of limestone, so that were actually high quality cement. So which when mixed with stone chips hardened into concrete. So actually the limestone cement is mixed with stone chips and that hardened into concrete. So this made construction of large structures easier and also faster. This became easier and faster. Understood? So that you can see in the same page, I mean page number 63 and the figure 5b and figure 6 you can observe that. Understood? Now, let us discuss about building temples, mosques, and tanks. Buildings, temples, mosques, and tanks. Buildings, temples, mosques, and temples. Sorry, so mosques and tanks. Okay, so buildings, temples, I mean building temples, not buildings, temples, building temples, mosques, and tanks. See, temples and mosques were beautifully constructed. That we all of you knows that. So why? Because they were places of worship, whatever it may be, the temples and the mosques. So these temples and mosques were beautifully constructed. So why they were beautifully constructed? Because so these places were places of worship. ಪೂಜ್ಯನೀಯ ಸ್ಥಳಗಳು ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಕಮಿಟಿ ಅಥವಾ ಧರ್ಮ ಜನಾಂಗ. So they were also made to demonstrate the power. Getting now. So these the constructions, the beautiful temples and the beautiful mosques and even the tanks that shows that demonstrate the power, wealth, and even the devotion of the patron also. Getting dear students. So they were also meant to demonstrate the power and wealth and devotion of the patron also. For example, Rajarajeshwara temple. Rajarajeshwara temple. So here an inscription mentions that It was built by King Rajaraja Deva. Understood? So the Rajarajeshwara temple, it was built by King Rajaraja Deva. Why it was built now? For the worship of his god Rajarajeshwara. Understood now? So for the worship of his god Rajarajeshwara, Rajaraja Deva was the king, so he was built Rajarajeshwara temple. So you can notice that. So how the names of the ruler and the god are very similar. So the name of the king also Raja Raja Deva, and even the god also Raja Rajeshwara. The god name also. See here, the ruler and the god are very similar. So the king took the god's name because it was auspicious and he wanted to appear like a god. Getting these students. Why the king took the god's name? So why? Because no, it was auspicious and he wanted it to appear like a god. The king, he wanted it to appear like a god. So through the rituals of worship, how? Through the rituals of worship in the temple, one god, that is Raja Raja Deva, honored another, that is the god Raja Rajeshwara. Getting dear students. See, the largest temples were all constructed by the kings. Getting them. So the largest temples were all constructed by kings. So the other lesser deities in the temple were gods and goddesses of the allies and subordinates of the ruler. So the largest temples were all constructed by the king and the other lesser deities in the temple. So and the other gods and goddesses of the allies. So these are all actually built by constructed by the allies and subordinates of the ruler. Subordinates of the ruler. Understood now. See, the temple was a miniature model of the world ruled by the king and his allies. So please keep in your mind, the temple, it was a miniature model of the world ruled by the king and his allies. As they worshipped their deities together in the royal temples, together, it seemed as if they brought the just rule of the gods on earth. This is what the imagination. Getting dear students, at the next class we are going to discuss about Muslim sultans and padshahs. So how that we are going to discuss in the next class. Thank you. Have a nice day.